All right. Well, today is a really special episode because this is my first podcast episode with a special guest. And I know this is the perfect special guest for the first interview on Finally Enough. So today I have with me Jana Wilson. And Jana is an emotional healing educator, meditation teacher, retreat leader, hypnotherapist, heart math facilitator, and founder of the Emotional Healing System, and author of her recently released book, Wise Little One. And I'm so excited you're here, Jana. So thanks for being on the podcast and welcome.
Thank you, Anna. I'm so happy to be here. I just loved getting your questions to prepare for this because it sounds like we have some things in common, which always feels good when someone's read the book and they can relate in some way and it resonates. So thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. Absolutely. Well, yeah, if you wouldn't mind first, so where should we begin? Wise Little One, would you want to share a little bit about the premise of the book? If someone asked you, what's the book about? What would you say?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a journey. It's a memoir, prescriptive memoir, but it's the journey of childhood trauma, of how to overcome really adverse experiences in childhood. And of course, looking at it from the perspective that I look at it today and looking back, which I do in the book, really helping the reader see how mom and dad conditioned them, how they were conditioned by their family of origin, and how this intergenerational trauma can happen, right, through families. So the book was really a gift to my family because I consider myself a cycle breaker and, dysfunctional family. And so the book is, me very vulnerably, as you know, sharing parts of my developmental trauma that led me to make choices that I didn't value myself, that, I ended up having experiences that were further traumatizing to myself. It's kind of like we pick up where mom and dad left off and we start doing those same things to ourselves or whoever raised us or, the collective group of people who raised us, extended family, teachers, etc. And we kind of pick up where they leave off. And so the book, it was my really gift to my family, but to the world too, to students and to people who find it, to show that it is possible to overcome, to transcend and transform trauma and make, I always like that saying, make lemonade out of your lemons.
Yeah. To say make lemonade out of your lemons is really an understatement of what I saw in the book, of just what it was really, really difficult even to read, especially in the beginning, because I don't know that I've ever read such a vulnerable memoir before. And I've read many, and it just, the vulnerability it was so raw and real. And when you went into the detail of your childhood, it's just really amazing to see where you are now as someone who helps other people break the cycle of trauma, because it just seems like a situation that would be impossible to get out of, how alone you were in your childhood, with your parents having their own issues with their own trauma. And really, kind of, do you feel like you raised yourself in a way? I mean, it's just incredible.
Yeah, thank you so much for the acknowledgement and validation. It means so much to me, Anna, because you get me, right? You get it. You get that. I mean, what I hear when you say that is clearly you've done the work to meet yourself so that you could be so vulnerable and share this with the world, right? There's like, I have no shame in any of those past experiences. How was I able to raise myself? I mean, I certainly had a very devoted grandmother who was there for me. She was definitely a resource. I was very spiritual at a young age, as you know. And so I feel like that trauma, it was the only thing I had to hold on to, was this connection to the Holy Spirit, to Jesus, to, in my early years, I mean, that's how I viewed it. And I had some very profound mystical experiences as a child. And when you have that type of experience, it changes your life. It opens your mind, right? The Bible says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. My little mind as a child was being renewed because I had a fervent desire to connect to spirit, because that's where I found peace and safety. And where was that? Inside of me, right? Like, yeah, I connected in the Pentecostal church, and the tambourine and the singing and the worship and all of that. And I would, go into a state of ecstasy, which we know is called slain in the spirit. These experiences were happening a lot because I was so frightened for my life that it was the only thing I could turn to, thankfully, right? Which is the truth of reality. That is what's real. This material world is, spirit gives rise to the material world. So the term, people say, oh, they're an old soul. Well, I remember hearing that even growing up, like, oh, she's an old soul, because I had to grow up so fast. And since then, I've learned a lot about soul ages, and I do believe old souls come here, pick up a lot of challenges like I did to overcome, so that because they have something greater to give to the world. I end the book, if you might remember in the epilogue, with a scripture where Jesus said, when you've been given much, much is expected. And it makes me a little emotional when I say that, because, holding space for people grieving and going through trauma. I mean, there's not really one person that's came on my path in 20 years, Anna, that I can't relate with. And some of them have had traumas much greater than even mine. But I think the gift of my trauma gave me that empathy, right? To hold space for someone to go to those dark places, because I went there.
And the only way you can hold space for them is because you've been there yourself.
Exactly. There's a light out, they're in darkness and they can't see that there is a light. There's a lot of spiritual bypassing terms. One of them might be, oh, it's happening for you, not to you. And I even use that in the book. But at some point, we have to take personal responsibility for whatever state of consciousness or emotional state we're in. And as soon as I began to do that, from reading the book, that's when everything shifted for me. I was no longer a victim. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you mind going in a little bit into your childhood and your family and your parents? Because for those who are listening who haven't yet read the book, so they kind of know what we're talking about.
Yeah. So mom and dad were beautiful, externally. Dad, was handsome. He kind of looked like Elvis. It's the 50s. They were best friends. Mom lost her dad. My father grew up in a very violent, alcoholic family. They were best friends because when mom lost her dad, my dad stepped in and was her best friend and really supported her. And then a few years later, they fall in love and they marry. They were, and we go back in time, even psychology is a fairly new science and medicine, right? Like, we're not talking, and certainly in the 50s, they weren't dealing with trauma and how to handle dysfunctional families and such. So they had their own, and they married at 19. So being young when you marry, and they had my brother at 20 and then me at 22, their brains weren't even developed. And so I grew up in the South, in the Bible Belt. I grew up very poor, labeled white trash. A lot of stigma placed on our family, right, because of domestic violence and all the things that were going on. And I never digested. I definitely took all of that on, right, and became, there was one question you had asked that you didn't see the word abuse in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, I didn't even realize that, Anna. And you asked me, did I deliberately leave it out because I didn't resonate with it? Not intentionally. I feel like maybe because I'm writing from the perspective of little Jana, she doesn't really know the word abuse. She's being abused, right? And yeah, I don't know. But that was a really good question. I was like, oh, I didn't even realize I left it out. But
Yeah, I always tell my clients that my dad grew up poor, and he always said, I never knew I was poor till the kids at school told me.
right.
Because you just don't know the way that you're living, you assume everybody else is living that.
Mom and dad were abusers, they both were abusive, but I did not, when we're little, we look at mom and dad like they are, the king and queen. They are our gods. They brought us into the world. They know. And of course, however they treat one another, they treat themselves and they treat us, our siblings, we can get conditioned after that. We model it. And my parents, my mother clearly did not value herself. Neither did my father. And so they taught me not to value myself, right? To abuse myself, to be the abuser of myself. And yeah, you asked me the biggest turning point, I think, was 12 years old when I was pulled out of my body and had, a near-death experience. I mean, some people call it astral travel, whatever happened. I feel like spirit pulled me out of my body in a moment of extreme trauma and fear. They're fighting, it's violent, and I'm all alone. My brother's not there, and I'm begging, dear God, please help me. I'm praying. And then the next thing I know, feel a peace that passes all understanding. And that just flooded through my entire body. And I remember thinking, if I'm dead, I like it. I want to stay here. And then all of a sudden I was like, where am I? What's happening? And I'm kind of like looking around, and I see I'm like in the cosmos, like in star nebulas and galaxies. And I ask, like, where am I? What's happening? And I'm told, those are not your parents. I am. And this is not your life. That is not your life. This is. And then boom, I was back in my body. And that awakening was so profound, as it gave me my voice, my throat opened, I became what I call the dragon slayer. There's an elephant in the room, we're going to talk about it. And so I was about bringing light. I think, being a Sagittarius born on the winter solstice, shooting the bow of truth, I was like all about shooting the bow. They didn't like it very much, but
And you mentioned about being growing up in the Pentecostal church, and that's one of the things I resonated with you in the book. Is I also grew up in the Pentecostal church, and there was a part of the book where you mentioned, I talked to God. He said, this is at church. I talked to God. He said, you don't have to be a Christian to go to heaven. Heaven is within each of us. God loves all his creation and doesn't judge like humans do. And the people, the leaders of the church did not much like that from what you said in the book.
No, it was actually my Sunday school teacher. So after I had that profound experience, I felt like I had the direct connect, right? I was connected, and every question I would ask, immediately I would know the answer. And the answer always felt freeing, felt expansive, gave me peace. So, the truth, when it sets you free, right? So for me, it was truth I was hearing, because I worried. I was smart enough to know at a young age, yes, I had it bad, but I also watched TV and saw tribes and parts of Africa and the equator, and I thought, oh gosh, well, I have it at least better than them, and I'm not eating dirt for lunch. And so I had this awareness that in some way I was privileged. And then therefore it allowed me to have a lot of gratitude Instead of being woe is me, poor me, poor me, I began to feel more grateful for what I could create. And so I lived in my imaginary world a lot. And I talk about that in the book, which allowed me to manifest a lot of really cool things, pretty cool experiences, right? So, I mean, especially for a girl in a trailer in Central Florida on food stamps and, ending up, with some of those experiences. I don't want spoiler alert for the readers, but yeah, I went into Sunday school after that experience, and I just, I couldn't sit there and be quiet. I could not just blindly obey and not question. And so I said, God told me that you don't have to be a Christian, like that He loves everybody. There's no heaven or hell. That's, it's that kingdom of heaven is within Jesus. And I knew scripture, so and they kicked me out of Hopewell Baptist Church.
They told you couldn't come back?
I couldn't come back. Yeah, that I was, listening to the devil, and I was blasphemous, and, I needed to leave. And that was really painful for me, because that was the only place every weekend that I did feel safe, and like I had a place to go. I'd get on the bus, and I was the only one in my family going. My brother didn't go. My mom and dad sure didn't go. Dad was rarely there. So yeah, it was very Christian of them. They just kicked me out.
Wow. And so what did you do after that to stay? Obviously, you don't need church to stay connected to God, but that must have been difficult when you were a kid after you got kicked out. What did you do to have a safer place to go?
12, right? So from 12 to 15, I still played Barbie dolls. I still spent a lot of time in an imaginary world. Some people might say it was disassociation. And yeah, I was disassociating from, the painful existence that I lived in. I had a mother who was clinically depressed. She was bipolar. I never knew what I was going to get when I got home. My grades were really bad. No one was there my mom dropped out of school in 9th grade, so I was the first out of my family to finish high school, let alone go to college. It was like, anyway, I think, cannabis, I talk about, cannabis and my teenage years became a real way for me to, actually connect in my heart and listen even clearer. Because when I was high, I could hear like, okay, this too shall pass. You just got to get through this. You're going to be okay. As soon as I got out of that small town and I went away to school, I no longer smoked cannabis. I didn't do any of that because I didn't need to, right? I still had challenges in college. As you know, I was date raped. I still was, searching. But by the time I was 20, so it took some time, 8 years, but 8 years really isn't a lot. And it is from 12 to 20, right? There's a lot that goes on. But by the time I turned 20, I was working for Maybelline, traveling around the country, and that book, You, literally fell off, the bookshelf at that book. I usually have it here. And it is a Christian book. It was written in 1932, and it's, out of print. And, it talks about the first chapter. What is the most interesting and important subject in the world? This was asked of a group of university students. The answer was oneself. To really know oneself is the most inspiring thing in the world. And said, your real self is a spiritual being all the way through. Your mind is spirit invisible. Your body is spirit material. You are a divine child, and God is your father. So it had some kind of older, but it had a lot of metaphysics, a lot of one of the chapters, law of attraction. I mean, 1935, yeah, the book was like law of attraction. So I wake up, and then the memory of the experience at 12 years old becomes really clear again. It's kind of like it was vague. I didn't think of it much. It was something that had happened because of trauma. I wanted to push all that away, right? When this book came into my life, all of that started to bubble forth. Then I began to just have certain thoughts of, well, what if it happened, for me? Then, of course, Brian Weiss's book, Many Lives, Many Masters, came into my life, which changed my life because it opened my mind up to the mystery that we don't know what happens after we die, right? But the mystery that, what if my soul chose those parents? And once I began to view from that perspective, through that lens, I began to see myself as not this weak, poor, white trash girl from Central Florida, but a pretty badass soul.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I chose it, that father and that mother and those experiences, then what was possible for me in my life? What was I here for? I had some greater purpose, and I needed to get focused on figuring out what that was. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was
Wow.
amazing. It was life-changing. You said, what would you say to someone who reads your memoir that says, I didn't experience that level of trauma?
Right.
That was a really good question.
Yeah, many of the people listening to, I mean, all walks of life, but many of my listeners struggled to identify their childhood trauma because maybe on the outside, they were taken to church, they were taken to soccer practice, their parents weren't divorced, their parents were not alcoholics. And so they've been told, like, oh, did you come from an alcoholic home? No, I didn't. So what's wrong with me that I'm having all of these? So, and that was definitely my experience as well. So yeah, a lot of people would read this and be like, wow, my childhood was not, not to that extent. So how would you respond to them in terms of their trauma healing?
Well, there's a few ways. We'll think about in the book too, where I share, like, even how I was being conditioned to put my dad's feelings first, right? That, oh, poor Papa, he would say, come give me love. Like, I was being conditioned. I have to give up what I want to make him feel. So many people can relate to that, right? Like, that's a common universal theme. So there are themes that even people who haven't experienced trauma like me that have read it that said, I could still relate with so much because they're being conditioned to be caretakers, right? To care for their parents, to put their needs first or whatever. So there's archetypes of childhood trauma, and parents who don't, how we know that we love one another is my grandmother did this. When I spoke, she hung on every word. She listened. She was present. I knew she loved me. She touched every love language, right? Words of affirmation. She lifted me up. She was present. So parents who don't see or hear children, and we have sayings for that, children are to be seen and not heard. And I got that. I heard that a lot growing up. So that is a trauma to a child under the age of 7. A child who has a parent who really isn't present. My grandson will say sometimes to his parents and to me too, if we're on our phone, put your phone down and be present. He'll ask for it. He's very emotionally intelligent. So I'm not seen or heard by mom. That's a trauma. And, trauma is relative too. It's like saying my arm's broke, your finger's broke. My arm's more important than your finger. No, that's being comparing, right? Trauma is all relative to the person who's experiencing it. So parents who don't model good boundaries, that's a trauma to a child. They overshare about the other parent, or they, can't modulate their emotions and regulate them, and they explode. Right? That's a trauma to a child. Just, even if they don't hit them or say anything mean to them, but they just are really angry and slam doors and stuff like that, that can traumatize a child. Parents who live vicariously through us, the typical stage mom or sports dad, and push. You got to do this career. You've got to go this path. That's a trauma. Parents who, so there's different types of archetypes of parental trauma, because let's face it, becoming a parent doesn't come with a manual. now we have people like Dr. Shafali, who's written, conscious parenting and, beautiful books to support and training coaches to become coaches to teach parents how to be a conscious parent. So, we're really making strides in that area. That's for sure.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad so much of what you just described is coming into the conversation about parenting, because I'd say, I don't know if you'd agree, in the, 20, 30 plus years ago, that was the conversation about abuse and about childhood trauma. It was surrounding alcoholism, obviously physical or sexual abuse. And fortunately, and obviously those things are traumas. And then we're also getting deeper into the conversation about some of the things you described. So I'm so glad for that being more and more talked about, because so many people struggle and never, I think about the people who never come to realize what they really went through in their childhood because it may not have been so apparent.
Right. And then they judge themselves.
Yeah.
You may have heard me share this on another podcast, but this is a client who came to me. She was in her early 40s. She had 2 daughters, happily married, just like, why am I not happy? What is wrong with me? Like, I have a loving husband. I have 2 healthy children. Like, I can't find, and of course I practice spiritual psychology. So it's a combination of both. In a hypnotherapy session, I guide her back. She remembers at 5 years old, she was on a vacation. It was the first time they had ever taken a vacation that she remembered, which is common. Most people don't have a lot of memory prior to 5. They're in by a lake. The lake is murky. She doesn't want to go in. Rather than listening to her when she's screaming, I don't want to go in, and crying, they force her in the lake. In that moment, I said, you're there. Now, what did you make it mean about something significant just happened? And she said that my feelings don't matter. And then I said, okay, and what did you make it mean about the world? And she said, other people know better. They know better. So the reason why she was unhappy, everything she talked about was no one listens to her. Her feelings don't matter. She's unhappy, like nobody cares, like nobody, because she got conditioned to not trust her wise little one. So she was disconnected from her emotions. And she believed her husband knew. And then when he made a choice that she didn't like, she was resentful and angry and passive aggressive. And she was always unhappy because she wasn't advocating for herself. So sometimes it's something that, it's in our subconscious, and we need to, the hypnotherapy, by the way, is the only thing that I found personally for myself and working with clients, other than doing some kind of maybe psychedelic assisted therapy, that can help somebody really get to subconscious memory and get down to the nitty gritty, like the root cause of why am I in pain and suffering? I had a great childhood. My parents were fine. They're still married. They never beat me. They provided for me. But it was something so innocent, so benign. She never would have pinpointed that event. But as soon as she connected with her little girl inside, the little girl showed her that first memory popped up. She's standing, she looked down, she could see the mud in her feet. She could see the murky water. They're jumping off into the lake. Everybody's having fun, but she wants no part of it. Now, had they had said, you know what, it's okay, honey. You just sit here and build a little castle, and, you come in when you're ready. She probably would have eventually did. Right? She would have went into the water, but they didn't allow her that space. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you as well about forgiveness, because I've read a lot online recently, the conversation of you don't have to forgive your abusers or your caregivers and then there are the people that say you must forgive. So how did you approach forgiveness, or how do you answer that question with your own caregivers? And do you believe that forgiveness is necessary for healing?
Absolutely is necessary, because it's the gift you give to yourself. It has nothing to do with the other person at all. And forgiveness is looking at a past experience and saying it happened. Not that it shouldn't have happened. You wish it wouldn't have happened, hoping, wishing, dreaming, all of that it shouldn't have happened. It's coming to the reality it happened. Now, what was the lesson? Right? What was the lesson in it? It happened for me that I'm in earth school. I'm here to learn. Let me get busy. This is how we transform karma. It's a universal law. Most people suffer it. That's the first way you transform karma. Suffer. Woe is me, poor me. This person did this to me. They stay in story. They can't forgive because it was unforgivable, they say. So they hold on. They eat the poison expecting the other person to die, right? That saying. The second way, as you keep expanding your awareness and your consciousness and you're taking responsibility for your own life experience, you go, okay, it happened. So what was the lesson in my father being inappropriate with me sexually, with me, him physically abusing me, my mother, my brother, all that my father did? What was the lesson? There's an overarching lesson. Oh, he didn't value himself. So all I had to do was go to the opposite. The lesson was he was teaching me I need to value myself and not allow a man to treat me the way he treated my mother or the way so early on, I was really clear with my boundaries with him. I said to him, the last time I spoke to him, and I share that in the book, that, I can have a relationship with you, Dad, if you're working a program. But if you're not, I have boundaries. I forgive you for what you did. But it doesn't mean I'm breaking bread with you. Doesn't mean I'm going to have a relationship with you, because one of the people who, that question, like, if you could spend the day with anybody, who would it be? For me, it was always Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So Archbishop took, the South Africans, he guided them while Mandela was still in prison through apartheid, through, his country being burned up, seeing his people being burned with tires of kerosene in the streets, like treated like inhumane. And he never said retaliate. He operated like a Gandhi, right? Like in high integrity. And during the reconciliation trials, he wept a lot while they were being sentenced. And they said, why are you weeping for these people? They persecuted us. And he said, it talks about a proverb in Africa called Ubuntu, Ubuntu. Ubuntu means I exist because of you. This is the ultimate truth. If I hurt you, I'm only hurting myself, right? But he said, always forgive, never forget.
I think that's so true. And I think that's where sometimes people get hung up, that they think forgiveness means not having boundaries with that person or allowing that person into their life without boundaries or without conditions. And those are just not the same thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, I have no desire if I kind of, this is the way I teach. I say to someone, listen, the first time someone trespasses against you, they cross a boundary, they do something that you become aware is out of alignment for you, you communicate it. You say, when you did this thing, I'll give an example. I had a woman recently. She was trying to hook me in to make me responsible for her feelings. And she said, I had canceled because it was snowing. I canceled an event with her. And she said, well, when you're sincere about getting together, let me know. So that was a hook, right? She was throwing it at me. She couldn't manage her disappointment. And as adults, we have to learn how to manage our disappointments and not put it on others, because they're not responsible for us. I had no intent to hurt her by canceling. It started snowing. It was, anyway. So I knew, so I thought, I'm gonna have a conversation with her. And, what was your intent behind that statement? Well, you weren't, you canceled on me and you weren't sincere about getting together. I said, okay, that's not true. That's untrue. That's a story you're telling yourself, right? That wasn't true. And you're making me responsible for your feelings. And you're an adult and you need to learn how to manage disappointment and not make the other person responsible. So that doesn't work for me. So know in the future, if you're upset about something, you need to process it and come to me and say, what was your intent? When you did this, I told myself you weren't sincere about getting together with me. Is that true? And of course I would have been like, absolutely not. Like,
Mm.
so you let them know that doesn't work, you know, you give them grace. And if they do it again, now you go, okay, remember we had a conversation about this before. And I had a boundary. And, you know, so now I'm going to let you know if it happens again, I'm withdrawing from this relationship because, you know, it feels like you're not able to respect my boundary of, you know, I'm not responsible for your feelings. I'm not interested in codependent relationship. I'm responsible for me. You're responsible for you. You work out your stuff. You come to me. We have a healthy relationship. That's co-commitment, not codependency. Because
Yeah.
codependency exists anytime two dependent people get together and hand off their feelings to one another. There's a caretaker and a taker. Right. Takers are usually the addicts or the people who are, I can't, you know, they can't function. And the caretaker is the rescuer. Right. That comes in. And I was a classic caretaker, raised by, you know, two takers. So I became their caretaker. I mean, I would say to my mom, when I grow up, I'll take care of you. And I was in my 50s. I was still getting the pain of the lesson. I am not responsible for my mother.
Yeah. I think codependency, people have a very specific picture in their mind of what codependency looks like in a relationship, in a romantic relationship where one person is an alcoholic and one person, but it can happen at work. It can happen in friendships. It can happen in like the colleague example you just explained. So I think if we don't see that, then we can miss those times when other people are trying to make us responsible for their feelings or vice versa. So,
like you and I, you know, because I mean, we are in the helping profession. So people who are drawn to this profession in general usually are recovering caretakers, right? Because we want to help, and caretakers have this intent to want to help. When we unpack it, though, and we get deeper and deeper, you begin to see a lot of my behavior, I'm going to speak personally, was based on a survival, right? So it was based on, I gotta meet your needs and make you so I'm safe. And, you know, it's so unconscious. And in this relationship I was sharing before, in hindsight, I could see she was alone. She didn't have a husband. She struggled financially. My heart went out to her. So I kept, you know, we'd go out. I'd always pick up the bill. I was caretaking because I told myself, well, I'm just caring. I'm just thoughtful. But really it was, you know, if I unpack it and I'm honest with myself, there's a little superiority in that. There's a little, I'm better. I have more. Let me give.
Like you can't take care of yourself,
Of
so I must
yourself.
take care of you.
Exactly. It's selfishness. And, you know, it's an ongoing journey. I mean, because this story I'm just telling you was less than 2 years ago. So I still get into these entanglements and I'm like, oh my God, you know, it's spiraling up all the time, right?
Likewise. Yeah, it's always a journey. It is. And yeah, that brings me to another question I had for you, which is there was so much vulnerability in the book. You detailed a time in your life after a traumatic event with your parents that you had a problem with bedwetting when you were staying with your relatives. You also explained a time in your adult life when you were with a partner that you ultimately found out you were not really aligned and that person maybe wasn't a kind person, I think is how you put it in the book. So how were you able to actually share these vulnerable stories?
Again, when you meet yourself, so part of my formal training is in shadow work and integrating, right? Not just healing, integrating parts of myself. And so, you know, the part of myself that you're talking about when I divorced and I had that one relationship, I was in witnessing a lot of it, you know, but I knew I needed to go there. I needed to go to the bottom of what I had been trying to hide out in my first marriage and avoid. I needed to feel that dynamic of that extreme passion like my parents had. They were very in love to their level of love, but there was a lot of passion. And this person was my father. It was, he and I got together, and it was, so the way that I could share that is because I kept taking responsibility. Oh, I'm still when I was in Hawaii, when I finally got the soul slap from the teenager, right before that, I was in so much emotional pain, and there was a storm, and I was out by the beach by myself, and I'm screaming, and no one could hear me because it was just so loud, the waves and everything. And I was crying, and I just could hear Spirit say, just keep saying, you're still healing your father wound. This is all about your father. Because this guy was a musician like my dad. He was volatile. He wasn't an alcoholic, but he had a lot of those same things that I found, bad boy, interesting, sexy. I was like, ooh, here I am 47 years old, and I'm feeling like I'm, back in my 20s. Like he was a little younger than me. It was like this exciting, but oh my God, it was heart-wrenching. It just felt like my heart was constantly in a grip, in a vice. And, but, I had to meet the old desperate woman that nobody's going to want, the emotional healing teacher that doesn't have her shit together. She's a fraud. She's an imposter. Like you have to go to those darkest places and look in the mirror and say, there is a part of me that is an imposter, that is desperate, that's a fraud, and work with it. There's a part of me that is there. Sometimes I am, until it loses its grip. And once it loses its grip, it's integrated. So somebody could come along and go, you're a fraud. I saw you, blah, 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 losing your temper, and you say you're an emotional healing. Yeah, I'm human. I'm wabi-sabi. I can do that sometimes. That's how you can share that stuff without fear of what people are going to think. Because if you accept yourself, you don't give a crap what they think.
Yeah. And you mentioned in the very beginning of this conversation about shame, and how the reason you're able to share those things is because you have no shame with them anymore. And so you can share them. There's nothing anyone could say, or it has no power over you.
It'll still activate my pain body, that emotional, part of me that's accumulated from lifetime. I'll still get activated, but the practices that I teach, really mindlessness, really, not mindfulness. It's just being the witness, right? From meditating so long, is I can feel it rise. I can feel the trigger. I can feel and I can breathe through it and hold it and stay with it. And it's like I relate to it like she's having a temper tantrum, my little girl. And so I'm just like, okay, I get it. Like internally, this person's really pushing your buttons. They're really triggering you. This experience really, but I'm here. We're okay. We're safe. And so I can regulate my emotional state. And then I can, once I'm, in a more homeostasis, more balanced state, I can then look at what was it that triggered me? What kind of person would do that? What did I think they thought of me? That I'm a bitch, that I'm this, that I'm that. Okay. Then I come to the place, well, you can be sometimes. You have been in the past. Talk about abuser. Like that was a big one, because I had to embrace that I'm an abuser because I was abusing myself.
Wow. And
so, and I wouldn't be in a relationship with someone, and this guy who was abusive, if I'm still not abusing myself. So he was my teacher. Our teachers are the ones that challenge us the most, right? That push our buttons. So I was courageous enough to just dive into this. One time we were in Hawaii on a different trip early in my relationship with this guy, and he was so possessive and jealous. And I was having dinner with this famous Australian windsurfer. And we're at this table and they're all there. Kai Lenny was there, big surfers and stuff. And he drove by, this guy I'd been dating, and then started calling me. And I thought, oh God, he's going to embarrass me. He's going to come say something. So I jump up from the table and I leave, and my phone butt dials my ex-husband. And my ex-husband hears this conversation with me and this guy.
Wow.
I mean, sometimes we have to be willing to get so humbled, right? Down to the, like, my ex-husband was like, I am worried about you. Like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm out in the world getting messy, healing my shit.
Oh,
So it
man.
takes courage. I was working with a client recently. She's divorcing her husband. He was abusive to her. Anyway, she was a caretaker. She fell into like a pattern, ended up being intimate with him. Their teenage daughter walks in and sees it. She's humiliated. I mean, her daughter's disgusted. They were happy her mother left the abusive father. And then she's like, and I'm like, she calls me, she's crying, she feels shame. Shame says I am bad. Guilt says I did something bad. She's feeling both. I'm bad. I did something bad. What's wrong with me? How could I go through all of this and put myself back? And I was like, you are a badass. You inspire me. And she's like, what? And I was like, yeah, you're allowing yourself to be human, to get to the depths of, clearly you needed to feel what you're feeling right now, the contrast, to get really clear. What do you want? And that's how we learn, right?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So that kind of brings me, wrapping up here soon. What would you tell someone? So they read your book, and this is their first introduction to a lot of the stuff we were just talking about a moment ago of, wow, I see some things in my own childhood. Maybe this is why my life as an adult isn't working the way that I expect it to. Where would you tell them to get started? What would you tell them?
Well, so consciousness is everything, right? If we're not aware, awareness and consciousness are synonymous. If we're not able to cultivate a witness, serving ourselves, then we'll keep getting caught in the loop of the conditioning from the past, right? There won't be, it's the definition of insanity. Keep doing the same things, expecting different results. So absolutely, without doubt, you have to accept, if you want to be emotionally intelligent and be able to regulate your emotions and not be at the mercy of your own thoughts and other people pushing your buttons, you have to meditate. It's non-optional. It's foundation. If you read like Emotional Intelligence 2.0 by Travis Bradberry, one of the best books on emotional intelligence, 4 skills: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management. So the foundation of all of them lies in self-awareness. If I'm not aware of what's going on in my internal world and able to regulate it on the fly, right, then I'm a slave essentially to my emotions. I'm going to continue to suffer because I'm identifying, I'm sad, I'm depressed. Can't be depressed or sad. There's just a part of you that's sad and depressed. And the inner child, people ask me, what is the inner child? It is your emotional self. It's just, I don't relate if I'm feeling, say, anxious. I don't say I'm feeling anxious. I say, oh, little Jana's anxious. What am I saying or doing that's making her feel that way? Because we operate as a wounded adult often, right? We go unconscious and we have conversations. And imagine if you're having a conversation, you're not in a relationship. I was talking to a young woman who's in her early 30s, and she's like, oh, I gotta get married, I gotta have babies, and my clock's ticking, and she's like freaking out. And I'm like, how does that feel when you keep telling yourself that? She's like, terrible. I'm like, okay, so you're terrorizing yourself. Your little girl's there, and she's like, and you're like, come on, like putting pressure, and it's too much, right? Like it overwhelms your system. So if you want to begin on a healing journey first, you have to get coherent, right? And coherency happens through being present, through learning how to just get quiet, observe thought, not run with it, and keep coming back to the present.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Well, Jana, I am so delighted to have this conversation with you, and I know the listeners are really going to benefit from it as well. So, can you let them know how they can get started finding your book and learning more about you?
Yes, I would love to. So people can find me, Anna, on janawilson.com. They can get the book on Amazon, of course. You can also buy it at my website. You can visit me at emotionalhealingretreats.com. We lead retreats here in Santa Fe and all over the country. And yeah.
Great. Well, thank you again so much. I loved the book, and that's why I was so thrilled to have you today. So, thanks so much for joining us, Jana.
Thank you. It was lovely to be here.